It's officially 2025, which means that the episode with Rhonda McEwen, the president of Victoria College, is officially the most watched podcast of 2024. In this video, I'm going to share some untold stories, how I got Rhonda on the podcast in the first place, and what I think is the biggest takeaway from this episode. I'll say I went in with some bias, and there was one thing that I was completely wrong on. Let's get into it. How did I land this interview? This might blow your mind, but I actually did. In late November, I received an email from a director at Victoria College saying, "Hi Carter, your podcast is so awesome and fun, not to mention so are you. Reaching out on behalf of President Rhonda McEwen to see if you'd be interested in having her on as a guest. P.S. Did we mention how much we loved your mustache in the summer?"
How do you feel about the stash you have growing?
This is crazy. And no lie, the day prior to receiving this email, I was actually talking to my friend saying how I've thought about asking one of these senior execs to come on for an episode before, but I'd never actually gone through with it because I never thought any of them would agree to speak with me. I'll admit, going into this interview with Rhonda, I had some big bias against the Victoria College administration because I thought they were the ones responsible for a lot of the woke garbage we're seeing at Victoria College. Turns out this isn't the case. This is going to link back to my main takeaway that I have from this episode. So this email completely caught me off guard. First thing I do, I text it, screenshot, send it to my parents just to be like, hey, your son isn't completely wasting his time at university. I replied and obviously agreed to do the episode. It would be an absolute honor to host President McEwen. And thank you for the mustache compliment. So we scheduled it for about 2 weeks in advance, and I'm racing through my mind trying to conjure up a motive for why Rhonda would want to do this episode. Is she going to try to discredit VOV? Is she going to try to make me look stupid? Maybe she's just trying to defend the reputation of the college because of the stuff I've said. I was preparing for the worst, but there was still just one thing that I could not wrap my head around, and it was that she reached out to me. This isn't like I was asking her to do the podcast and now forced her into a position where if she said no, it would be a bad look. She went out of her way to ask me to do this episode, which complete props and respect. By the end of this episode, and still to this day, I have a great opinion on Rhonda McEwen, on the president of this college. I think she's great. But it felt like an unnecessary risk. If we were going to debate, because I've shared some controversial opinions on this podcast, it seems like an unnecessary risk for her as the head of a University of Toronto college, Victoria College, than me, some podcast guy. So a few days go by and we're approaching the recording date. I'm trying to balance studying for finals with the biggest interview I'd ever had in my life up until that point. How do you possibly know the right time split for that? Most of the preparing I did for this episode was done at night as I was about to go to sleep, trying to envision different scenarios and different paths that the discussion could move down. I did come with notes, but the notes I prepare are more meant to provide a structure for the episode, not exactly a script and a checklist that you need to go down and cross every point off. There are some questions that I didn't get the time to ask her, like what are the 4 symbols on the Victoria College crest? I still don't know what these things are. There's a jersey here, 1 second. So obviously you have these 4. I can see physically what they are. I just don't understand the significance of why these 4 were chosen. I don't know if she would have known, but I thought that would have been an interesting question to ask. Another one was, why don't meal plan points carry over? In my first year, I lost a bunch of money for not using all of the meal plan points I had on my card. Didn't get to ask that. I didn't want to sacrifice the conversational style of the podcast to simply cross off a checklist of all the questions I did want to ask her. Anyways, December 5th rolls around. I head to her office at Northrop Frye. Absolutely beautiful office. It only takes me about 5 minutes to set up the podcast equipment, but I got there about 30 minutes in advance because I was quadruple checking everything. We've had technical difficulties in the past. This episode was not going to have any. I had to make sure. Rhonda eventually gets in. We meet each other for the first time. Very pleasant, and we're off. Starting the episode. Why does a podcast succeed? What is the key driver to make it so that your podcast not only gets good views on this episode that you record, but the next episode you record as well? Obviously, the number one thing is the content of the episode. If someone watches it and they enjoyed their experience, they're going to come back to watch the next one. That's easy. That's obvious. But besides that, the most successful podcasts of all time all have one thing in common, and that is that they are all exciting crossovers. Think even in terms of TV and movies. The Avengers did so well because Marvel found a way to create 4 independently successful superhero characters and then combine them into one shared universe. The Simpsons and Family Guy crossover was in the Family Guy's top 10 episodes of all time. In the podcast world, Joe Rogan and Donald Trump's episode hit like 40 million views in 3 days. People know Joe Rogan's message. People know Donald Trump's message. They can each probably pull a couple million views on their own. Put them together. Get them in the same room. And they nearly broke the internet. Mr. Beast and Ronaldo, the same thing. saying 50 million views in less than a month. I personally don't care about Mr. Beast and Ronaldo's episode, but there are millions of kids in the world who are seeing that and are thinking, oh my goodness, Mr. Beast and Ronaldo are in the same room. That's insane. So on a much smaller scale, the reason I think Rhonda's episode was number one of 2024 was not necessarily because of her, not necessarily because of me, but because people wanted to see what an interaction between myself and her would look like. The president of Victoria College and this crazy podcast guy meeting for the first time. I mentioned earlier how I'd gone in with some preconceived beliefs about the Victoria College administration. I thought they were to blame for a lot of the woke nonsense going on at Victoria College over the years. By the end of this episode, it was apparent to me that that was not the case. I was wrong. The admin is not as crazy as I thought. It's the students. I brought up the Queen's Park email scandal with her, expecting to hear a justification for why that was sent out to the students, but I didn't get one. I didn't get a justification. She sided with me. If you don't know what I'm talking about, you can go watch that video called Meanwhile in Canada. I'll put it in the description, or just skip to that part in her podcast episode using the timestamps. She didn't give a justification for the email. She said this wasn't approved by admin. In fact, admin didn't have any involvement in the email whatsoever. She even went as far as say maybe we need to check back how we're training the Dons to make sure that something like this doesn't slip through next time. Unreal. That blew my mind. I went in expecting to defend my position on why the email was completely out of line, but instead I get an agreement. I get a no, Carter, you're right. That was a mistake. Insane. At the end of the episode, I asked about Jacob Stuchney's disqualification, and Rhonda had never heard about it. My main takeaway from this interview, let me tell you, I was wrong about one thing in a big way. Student government and student organizations have much more influence than you might think. A lot of the garbage that you see, like deranged political emails or emotional VUSAC disqualifications, have nothing to do with the Victoria College administration. They don't even see this stuff. It isn't approved or permitted, nothing. This is the point where I realized why Rhonda was so receptive to doing this interview. When we think about politics, it's easy to see things as binary. We get caught up in liberal, conservative, whatever, but it's a spectrum. There's a reason why we call it the political spectrum. It's because it's a scale. VOV podcast might be mildly conservative. Obviously, I can understand that. I'd consider myself a little bit more than mildly conservative, but the podcast itself, I'd say, is pretty damn balanced. So let's call it mildly conservative. After speaking with Rhonda, I'm now of the belief that the Victoria College administration is actually only very mildly liberal. I don't think that they're crazy woke or anything. I think the wokeness is them being receptive to the students' requests. The students, you could say, are a little bit more woke, but that's Victoria College representing their customers in a way. So the administration themselves are mildly liberal on this scale. The Vic administration and VOV podcast might actually have more in common being mildly liberal and mildly conservative than the Vic administration would with these extreme woke students who've completely went this way. The gap between VOV and Vic administration is like this. The gap between Vic administration and these extreme left activists is like this. It's way wider. These are the same kids who raided the old Vic building. Some of you might not remember this, but back in spring 2023, these clowns raided the old Vic building, occupied Vic, because they refused to divest from fossil fuels. They set up tents and slept overnight, literally just bombarded the place with flags. I'm sure you can guess which ones. This is where the conservatives lose their mind and say, what do you mean Victoria College isn't woke? They promote all this gay stuff, blah, blah, blah. They also leave me alone. They let me promote free speech. They literally ask to be a guest on the podcast. Victoria College is a very open place. Understand that. As a university should be. If you have the ambition to start a club that promotes being gay, you can do that. Victoria College will leave you alone. If you have the ambition to start a podcast that lets people speak their minds and say, you can do that too. Academia will always lean more liberal because the typical professor personality profile tends higher in trait openness, which is linked to being more curious and imaginative. So I really think Rhonda and I actually had more in common than Rhonda and some of these ultra left activists. That might be a way to get things done. Sure, you occupied Vic, so they divested, whatever. I'd like to think that my approach actually worked better because I didn't even ask for Rhonda to come on the podcast. She felt implored. And not only that, I still have the respect of the administration. You think you're still going to have the respect of the leaders and the executives at this college when you literally raid a historical building like Victoria College? That's embarrassing. I also want to point out that organizations, especially student organizations, don't tend to work in complete synchronicity. They're messy. Even when 9 out of 10 students in a student club hate you, there's always that one. There's always that one guy or girl who secretly on the low likes you, your own secret agent who reports back, because there's a recurring trait among those who align with the vocal consensus. They're bad at detecting others' opinions. Sometimes they have such a heavy bias against people with dissenting views that their way of determining whether or not someone is likely to hold ultra-liberal opinions is purely based on whether or not they believe whoever they're interacting with is a good person. I know this because I'm speaking from personal experience. In first year, I didn't share my opinions like this at all because I didn't have a podcast. Once I got this podcast, I had friends who finally then heard what I truly believed, what I was about, and they kind of stepped back. They revoked their friendship. They're like, oh my goodness, I didn't realize you were like this. Now, I knew that these people were liberal because they'd make it obvious 24/7. That doesn't mean I wasn't friends with them. If conservative students at U of T didn't learn how to make friends with liberals, it would be hard to have friends at all in university, mainly in first year because people are just trying to fit in. A woke U of T student is comfortable sharing their opinions because the culture overtly accepts them. Conservatives don't speak up, so no one really knows who they are. The point I'm trying to make is that although they're a minority, there are conservative students in these student organizations, and sometimes they tell me the awful things that these people have to say about VOV. It's fantastic. I have eyes and ears everywhere. But these student leaders have real authority. I was completely wrong about one thing. I thought student government was useless, but after that podcast with Rhonda, I realized that's not the case. These students actually have a lot more influence than you might think. Can you imagine me as a VUSAC president? The craziest part too is that if I ran, I think I would win. Think about it. The voter turnout for the VUSAC elections is like 15%. Nobody votes in that. I think I would be able to activate a large proportion of that 85% who don't care. I could use the podcast, the campaign, the culture shift to have the VOV guy as the president of VUSAC would be massive. First order of business. No more dildo giveaways. All the money spent on dildos will be reinvested into literally anything else. Stuff people actually care about. We could do fitness challenges, fashion shows, parties. Who cares? Victoria College, I guarantee you, would be the strongest, smartest, hardest working, most fun, best looking. You name it, we would have it. But unfortunately, I won't be back to run for VUSAC. But if you believe in what I'm saying, take this idea and run with it. I think the reason that I would win is because I've spent the last 2 years kind of proving my character, kind of showing who I am, showing that I'm willing to put my foot in the fire first. So if you were to campaign, you have to find a way to somewhat show that you have balls, that you're not just towing around trying to get everyone to like you. The woke students at Victoria College, although they might be the loudest, they're actually not the biggest population. A lot of the people, as you see from the guests that we have on this podcast, the guests on this podcast are a much better representation of the students at this school than any student government we have here. So if you want to run for VUSAC president, you have to prove that you're not afraid of these social justice warriors who will come and scream in your face, call you a terrible person. You have to do it in a way that isn't malicious or hateful or any of these things. And I think you'd have a really good chance of winning. Honestly, if you wanted to go all out with it, you could campaign also to reinvest the money that the VUSAC president gets paid. The VUSAC president, I don't know if anyone knows this, gets paid $8,000 to do that job. And sometimes there's not even someone else running against them to get into that position. So few people actually care about student government and understand the perks that comes with it and understand the influence that comes with it. If you campaigned, and I understand that not everyone's in the financial position for this, okay? So if you're not in the financial position, that's fine. But if you are, you could campaign to take that $8,000 and reinvest some or all of it into events for the college. Imagine how huge that would be. That's another huge reason for people to want to vote for you, showing that you're not doing it for selfish reasons. People might not be financially capable of doing that, but I'm just brainstorming. So once again, and this goes for all conservative students at U of T, whether you're running to be VUSAC president or not. If you watch that episode with Rhonda and I, Victoria College is not going to put the hammer down on you for sharing your opinion. The only reason that you'd be afraid to do it is because you're fearful of the wrath from the SJWs, which is a completely ridiculous reason to not speak up. I personally believe that the tides are shifting in the culture. I think the culture is becoming more conservative. I think people are out with the woke nonsense. And if you're still afraid to speak up in this time, you're eventually going to miss out on a great opportunity to showcase bravery. At U of T, all it takes for a conservative student to be seen as brave is to speak his or her mind unapologetically and honestly. But once conservative ideas become mainstream and once that's the culture, then no one cares. Respect can only be earned by voicing thoughtful truths that are often considered off limits. My cousin goes to a very conservative school. Nobody there believes that you're brave by saying there are only two genders. For one of them to be brave, you have to go cliff diving or something. Once once the mainstream culture at universities course corrects and we get a little bit more normalcy back, you're going to feel like an idiot for not saying out loud, honestly, openly, without fear, without holding back, that dildo giveaways should be defunded. You're going to look back at yourself in a few years' time, look at yourself now in 2025 and think, why was I afraid to say that giving away sex toys with student fees at the University of Toronto was probably an awful idea? You're afraid to say it because you know you're going to get yelled at by the blue-haired mafia. You can be afraid of the blue-haired mafia if you want. I know I'm not. I know a lot of my boys at U of T who I have tons of respect for, who are actual men, aren't afraid of that. So do what you want. All in all, the episode was fantastic. It went great. We wrapped up in about 2 hours, got my equipment out of there, got to editing, made the trailer. Trailer turned out better than I was expecting it to, honestly. Another thing I will say, I messaged 4 Vic affiliated accounts on Instagram if they could reshare the episode with Rhonda. 2 of them said yes, and 2 of them ghosted me. So this was also another thing that I realized, that it at the end of the day is really all about the people. I said earlier how organizations, student organizations are messy. They're gonna have all sorts of different individuals in the organization. It's not like it can work in complete synchronicity. It's not like the entire VUSAC or Victoria College whatever is out to get you. Maybe 90% of the people there don't like it, but there's some who are on your side. So I've realized that to fix a lot of these issues, it's really about fixing the individuals. The 2 accounts who didn't repost the interview were Vic College Life and Vic College. So the 2 biggest Victoria College accounts. I don't know who runs these accounts. I don't know who's behind the screen. But think of the mentality you have to see that the president of this college, whose Instagram account I'm in charge of, just did her first ever long form interview podcast like this with a student, with the #1 podcast, only podcast that this college has. It was 2 hours. It's got an incredible reception from the community. #1 episode of the year for us, but we're not going to repost it. That is insane. That is unbelievable. Even if the episode was trash, even if nobody watched it, you would still think that the Vic College page would see, oh, our president just did her first ever long form interview, podcast style, sit down one-on-one with a student at our school, with a 4th-year economics student. We should reshare this. The only reason they don't reshare it is because they, whoever this person is behind this account, thinks that although the Vic president just did her first ever long form interview podcast, we shouldn't post it because we don't like what this VOV account promotes. This is so deranged. I don't care because the podcast did well anyways. But this is the reason that the culture sometimes gets messed up, because you have individuals who think they have the authority to dictate what the culture of this college should be. I'm not defining culture with VOV. I'm just showing the actual reality of what it is. I'm bringing on the students and being like, let's hear these students out. Let's hear their voices. Who are the actual people at this college? Unlike the promotional materials that we're bombarded with from these accounts, what are the students actually about? But apparently Vic College and Vic College Life on Instagram think that they have, whoever the administrators of these accounts are, think that they have the moral authority to dictate what the culture should be. It's ridiculous. The fact that you don't share 2-hour interview, the first ever long form podcast that this president has ever done, I don't know. I think that's interesting, and I just think that that's how culture can really get messed up, when you have individuals who think that they can dictate what the culture should be for 4,000 students. Anyways, hope you enjoyed this video. Hope you enjoyed the podcast with Rhonda McHugh. It did very well. I'm very grateful for all of the support you guys have given this podcast over the years, and especially for that episode, it did very well. And one last thing I will touch on, I can't tell you exactly what Rhonda told me at the end of the podcast, once the cameras were off, once I was heading myself out. But all I can say is that I have pretty good reason to believe that VOV Podcast is the #1, the most influential student organization or club at Victoria College, which is unbelievable, and that's all thanks to the support from you. But the fact that Voices of Vic does better and is more engaging or entertaining to students than a lot of these clubs and levies who cost students money is incredible. VOV costs students nothing. I invested my personal money into this, mainly my time into this, but these other clubs and levies that no one actually cares about cost students hundreds and hundreds of dollars. It's awesome but disappointing at the same time. I sometimes just daydream about what VOV could do, what I could do if we had the same funding that a lot of these clubs do. We've done 2 giveaways. That's just money coming out of my own pocket. And it promotes the college much better than a lot of this other stuff. No offense, but these NPC videos that you see on the official accounts of what's your advice to first years? have fun. No one is actually seeing that and thinking, oh my God, Victoria College is the place to be. And I'm not dissing on the people in the videos. I'm just saying it's not the best promotional material. But a clip of me talking to another student from Victoria College about whatever is much more relatable. Someone might see that. Think about it. VOV has had over 1 million plays on Instagram. 80% of that is from Canada. Okay, let's be even more generous. 50% of that is from Toronto. So you have 500,000 Instagram plays coming out of Toronto. Even more safe, it's bigger than this, but 10% of the views are from 13 to 18-year-olds. Teenagers. So that's 50,000. You're telling me out of 50,000 views on these clips, you don't think maybe even one kid, some high school kid is seeing that and like, oh, where is this? This is at U of T, this is Victoria College. Oh, if I'm applying to U of T, I'm going to choose Victoria College. Because it doesn't really matter what college you're at really at the end of the day. It's U of T. That's the name. I think this podcast, even if it brings one student in, that's huge promotion other than these videos that are like, what's your favorite thing to do at Victoria College? Well, I really like hanging out with my friends, having dinner at Burwash, and taking naps. Nobody is convinced to go to Victoria College with this NPC language. No offense. Honestly, I'm not trying to be an asshole. I'm really not. Same with the emails. The emails don't feel like they're written by real people. I don't know what's going on. Hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you for watching. Thank you for the support you've given to this podcast over the years. Honestly means a lot. Hope you enjoyed this video. Hope you enjoyed the episode with Rhonda. And we will see you next Sunday, episode 90. Peace out.